The boy had not slept in a proper bed in many nights, and still the first thing he did when he saw the elderly woman standing frozen at the edge of the crosswalk on Lexington and Calvert was step forward, lower his voice the way his grandmother had taught him, and say, "Take my hand, ma'am. I will walk you across." No one around them slowed down. No one looked. In a city like Baltimore, on a windswept afternoon in winter, a small, thin boy in a torn coat, speaking gently to a white-haired stranger in a long camel-colored coat, was the kind of moment people stepped around. The way they stepped around a puddle, they could not quite see the bottom of. But that boy, Elias Reed, small for his age and so light on his feet that the wind sometimes seemed to lift him a half-inch off the sidewalk, did not know that the woman in front of him was worth more money than every bank, every office tower, every department store on the whole stretch of downtown they were standing in. He only knew that she was afraid. He only knew that her gloved hand was trembling slightly where it held the brass handle of a polished black cane. He only knew that the light had already changed twice and she had not moved, and that someone, anyone, ought to do something about that. Helping a person who needed helping, even when you had nothing in your own pockets, was the one thing his mother had told him before the accident that he should never grow too tired, or too cold, or too hungry to do. That single decision made in the pale winter light at the corner of two of Baltimore's oldest streets would set in motion a story that the city and eventually a great many people far beyond it would not forget. Before we get into it, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit the subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. Downtown Baltimore in winter had a particular kind of cold that did not announce itself the way other winters did. It crept. It found the seams of your jacket. It moved up under the cuffs of your jeans and settled in the bones of your ankles, and it stayed there, long after you had gone inside. The wind came up off the harbor and worked its way through the narrow streets, between the old marble courthouse and the row of bank buildings that had been standing since before anyone alive could remember. And by mid-afternoon, it had the strange, scrubbed quality of air that has been blown clean of everything except the cold itself. On a normal day, the sidewalks downtown were busy with men and women in long coats, moving fast between meetings, eyes on their phones, breath puffing out in short, impatient clouds. On this day, they were busy in exactly that way, which is to say that almost no one was looking up. Elias Reed stood on the corner of Lexington and Calvert, with his hands tucked into the sleeves of a navy coat that had been his uncle's, and before that had belonged to a man in a shelter who had given it away on a night even colder than this one. The coat was too long for him. The hem dragged near his knees. He had cinched it at the waist with a length of brown twine, because the buttons had been missing since he had received it, and he had learned in the past several weeks that a coat that did not close was almost the same as having no coat at all. His sneakers were a pair he had pulled out of a clean donation bin behind a church on North Avenue, and they were nearly the right size, which was the closest thing to luck he had been given in a long while. His backpack hooked over one shoulder, with a strap held together by safety pins. It held a spiral notebook, with most of the pages still blank, a pencil he had sharpened with a kitchen knife, a small framed photograph of his mother in a blue dress, and a single paper-wrapped peppermint. A woman at a bus stop had pressed into his hand on Tuesday without saying a word. He had been standing on that corner for some time, watching the foot traffic and trying to decide whether to walk several more blocks to the warming center before they closed the line for the night. He was not begging. He had tried that exactly once on his second day alone, and he had found that he could not bring himself to lift his eyes to the faces of the people passing him. And so he had spent 2 cold hours staring at the toes of his sneakers with his hand half raised and his throat closed, and had not received so much as a glance. Begging was not for him. He understood that now, so he had developed instead a quieter strategy, which was simply to stand in places where people might need something a small boy could provide. He had carried a folded stroller up the steps of a brownstone for a young mother recently, and she had given him a little money and a hot pretzel. He had picked up a dropped scarf for a businessman, and the man had nodded at him and walked on. But the nod had been the closest thing to being seen that he had felt in days, and he had carried it with him afterward, like a small, warm stone in his pocket. His mother had been gone for many months. She had been a night nurse at a hospital in Druid Hill, and she had been driving home before dawn on a stretch of road that froze before anyone expected it to freeze. And the car that hit her had been driven by a man who never even came to the funeral. His grandmother had taken him in after, and for a long while it had almost worked. The two of them in a small apartment above a laundromat on Green Mount with a radiator that knocked all night and a kitchen window that looked out at a courtyard where someone always seemed to be playing a radio. But his grandmother's heart had begun to fail in the fall. Slowly at first and then all at once, and the cousin who was supposed to come for him had not come, and the apartment had been locked by people he did not know on a Saturday morning, while he was at the corner store. And he had simply walked back to find the door taped with a yellow notice he could not read all the way through. He had slept in the stairwell of that building for the first several nights behind a row of recycling bins because no one had told him not to, and because the latch on the back door had been broken for years. On the fourth night, a man had come down the stairs late and seen him there, and had not been cruel about it, but had said quietly that the building was being watched now, and that Elias would have to find somewhere else. He had spent the next several nights moving. A bus terminal that closed at midnight but did not check the bathrooms until later. A laundromat on Charles that left its lights on all night and had a single hard plastic chair near the dryers where you could sit if you were quiet. The covered entryway of a closed bookstore on Tuesday and Wednesday. On one of those nights, the temperature had dropped sharply, and a woman walking her dog past the bookstore had pressed a little money into his hand and told him about the warming center. And he had walked there in the dark and had eaten a bowl of chili and slept on a cot in a room with many other people, and a man 2 cots over had cried in his sleep for most of the night. He had decided in the morning that he would only go back to the warming center when he could not stand the alternative. The reason he was standing on this particular corner at this particular hour had nothing to do with strategy. He had been walking back from the library on Cathedral, where he had been allowed to sit in the children's section for some time without anyone asking him a question, and he had taken a wrong turn near the courthouse and ended up downtown among the office buildings as the light was beginning to thin. He had stopped on the corner because his legs were tired and because the side of the bank building behind him broke the wind, and he had stood there long enough to count several full cycles of the traffic signal before he understood that the white-haired woman across the way was in trouble. The woman who finally caught Elias's eye that afternoon did not look like a woman who needed help. She looked at first glance like one of the many wealthy older Baltimoreans who lived in the brick townhouses up on Mount Vernon and came down to their lawyers' offices on Calvert Street the way other people came down to the post office. She was small, perhaps 5 feet in height and very straight-backed, with a head of soft white hair set in the kind of careful ways that suggested a standing weekly appointment somewhere. She wore a long camel-colored wool coat that fell almost to her ankles, buttoned all the way to the throat against the wind, and around her neck was a silk scarf in a pattern of small dark green leaves that had clearly been chosen with the coat in mind. Her gloves were soft gray leather, and her shoes were the sensible kind that older women wore when they had spent a lifetime walking on city sidewalks and had learned not to argue with their feet. In her right hand she held the polished black cane with a brass handle, and her left hand was free, fingers slightly curled, hovering near the lapel of her coat, as if she had been reaching for something inside it and had forgotten what. Her name was Eleanor Langston, and she was a woman in her later years. She had come down to Calvert Street that afternoon to sign a single sheet of paper in the office of a lawyer who had been handling her family's affairs since before she was born. And she had told the young woman at the front desk that she preferred to walk the several blocks back to where her car was waiting because the day was cold but bright and her doctor had been after her for months about getting more exercise. The young woman at the desk had looked at her doubtfully but had said only, "Of course, Mrs. Langston," Eleanor had walked the first 2 blocks easily, as she had walked the third more slowly. By the time she reached the corner of Lexington and Calvert, her hip, which had been replaced some years ago and had served her faithfully ever since, had begun to send up a low, insistent complaint, and the wind off the harbor had grown sharp enough to make her eyes water, and somewhere between one breath and the next, she had felt the small, flat panic that comes upon the elderly when their bodies remind them, without warning, that the simple things are not simple anymore. She had stopped at the curb. She had looked at the crosswalk, which was perhaps the length of a short city block and nothing more, and she had felt her hand tighten on the brass handle of the cane, and her feet refuse, very quietly, to move. The light had changed in her favor. She had not moved. The light had changed again against her, and a small wave of cars had passed, and she had stood at the edge of the curb with her free hand pressed lightly against the lapel of her coat, and had tried to remember how it was that a person decided to step forward. The cars had stopped again. The little white walking figure had appeared again on the signal across the street, and still her feet had not moved. She had stood at the corner of Lexington and Calvert for what she would later guess was some time, and not one of the dozens of people who passed within arm's length of her had stopped or slowed or noticed at all that an elderly woman in a long coat was frozen in place at the edge of a crosswalk in the middle of downtown Baltimore on a winter afternoon. Elias saw her from across the street before he understood what he was seeing. He saw first that she had been standing at the curb for too long, the way you notice that a bird in a yard has not flown in too long, and you understand, without being told, that the bird is hurt. He saw the small, careful sway of her body when she tried to lean forward and could not commit to the step. He saw the way her gloved hand fluttered at her chest, not clutching, just resting there. The way a person rests a hand on a railing they are not entirely sure will hold them. He saw the eyes of the people walking past her slide off her face, the way water slides off oiled paper, and he understood in the wordless way children sometimes understand things that adults have to be told twice, that the woman was not waiting for the light. The woman was waiting for help. He crossed the street at an angle against a light that was about to change, slipping between the front of one car and the back of another, in the way a child raised in a city learns to do without thinking. He came up beside her slowly, not from behind, because his grandmother had taught him that you never come up behind an older person on a sidewalk if you can help it, that a sudden voice at the back of an older person's neck was a thing that could knock them down without anyone laying a hand on them. He stopped just to her left, one full step away, far enough that she could see him clearly out of the corner of her eye and would not feel crowded. And he waited until she turned her head to look at him before he spoke. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out smaller than he had meant it to. He cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Eleanor Langston turned her face toward him slowly. Her eyes were a pale gray, the color of the harbor on an overcast morning, and they took a long moment to focus on the small boy standing beside her in the too long navy coat. She blinked once. She did not answer right away. Eleanor had spent many years on this earth, and she had learned at some point in the middle of those years that the best way to find out what a person was actually offering you was to give them a few seconds of silence and let them say it twice. "I am all right," she said finally, and her voice was lower than her small frame suggested, with the soft fraying edge that came to certain voices in their later years. "Only a little slower than I used to be." "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. He did not argue with her. His mother had taught him that you did not argue with grown people about how they were doing, especially older people, because they had their pride, and their pride was sometimes the only warm thing they had left to wrap around them. He looked at the crosswalk. He looked back at her. He looked down at the polished black cane and at the gloved hand wrapped around its handle, and he could see very faintly the small tremor in her fingers that she had been trying to hide. He took a breath. "Ma'am," he said, "if it is all the same to you, I'm going across this street anyway, and I would not mind walking with you. The wind has been pushing me around all afternoon, and I think two of us might do better than one." It was a small, gentle lie, the kind his grandmother had called a kindness wearing a coat, and Eleanor Langston recognized it for exactly what it was. Something at the very corner of her mouth lifted, the smallest possible amount, the way the curtain at a window lifts in a draft you did not know was there. She looked at the boy properly for the first time. She saw the navy coat that was too large for him, and the brown twine knotted at the waist. She saw the thinness of his wrists where they came out of the sleeves. She saw, more than anything, the careful steadiness of his eyes, which were dark brown and had a quality she had not seen in a child's eyes in a very long time, the quality of someone who had learned to look at the world without flinching. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that two of us might do better than one." She lifted her left hand, the free one, away from the lapel of her coat and held it out. Elias stepped forward and took it. Her glove was cold to the touch on the outside and warm on the inside, where her hand was, and her fingers, when they closed around his, were thinner than he had expected, and steadier than he had feared. "Take your time, ma'am," he said softly. "There is no hurry, the light will come around again." They stood there on the curb together, a small boy in a coat held shut with twine, and a small white-haired woman in a coat that had been tailored for her in a shop on Charles Street many years ago. And they waited for the little white figure to appear on the signal across the way. When it did, Elias did not pull. He did not lead. He simply shifted his weight forward, the way a person shifts when they are about to step off a curb. And he let her feel that shift through the joined hands, and he waited for her to step with him. She stepped. Her cane came down on the asphalt with a soft, certain tap. Her other foot followed. They were walking. The crosswalk at Lexington and Calvert is not a long crosswalk by the standards of downtown Baltimore. A healthy person can cross it in a short time. It took Eleanor Langston and Elias Reed longer. He matched his stride to hers without seeming to. He kept his free hand cupped slightly behind her elbow, not touching, just there, the way his grandmother had shown him how to walk an elderly aunt to the table at Thanksgiving when he was a small boy. He kept his eyes forward and to the left, watching the cars at the light, watching the impatient front bumper of a delivery van whose driver was tapping his thumb on the steering wheel and looking at his phone. The driver glanced up once and saw the two of them in the middle of the crosswalk. And Elias saw the man's face change from impatience to something softer in the space of a single blink. The driver lifted his hand slightly off the wheel in a small acknowledging gesture, a kind of permission he had no authority to grant but offered anyway. And Elias nodded at him through the windshield without breaking his stride. Halfway across, Eleanor spoke. She did not look at him when she did. She spoke the way people sometimes speak, when they are concentrating very hard on something else. "What is your name, young man?" "Elias, ma'am, Elias Reed." "Elias." She tested the name the way she might have tested a step on an old staircase. "A fine name. It has strength in it." "My mother chose it, ma'am." There was a pause of several steps. Eleanor had heard in her many years more sentences spoken by more people than she could ever recount, and she had developed somewhere along the way a fine ear for the sentences that carried more weight than their words. The phrase, "my mother chose it," with no verb of present action attached to it, with no, "she always says," or "she likes that," told her almost everything she needed to know about who was holding her hand. She did not press. She filed the knowledge away, the way she had filed many other small, heavy facts over the course of her life, and she kept walking. They reached the far curb. The cane came down. Elias waited until she had her balance, and then he stepped up onto the sidewalk and held her hand steady while she stepped up after him. She made a small sound of effort as the hip complained, and then she was up, and the two of them stood on the corner of Lexington and Calvert on the opposite side of the street from where they had started, and a thin, watery sunlight broke briefly through the clouds overhead and laid itself down on the sidewalk in a pea rectangle at their feet. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. He began to release her hand, the way you let go of a small bird you have been carrying back to a nest, slowly and with a kind of formal care. And Eleanor felt the release coming and tightened her fingers very briefly, not to hold him, only to make him pause. He paused. She looked at him. "May I ask you another favor, Elias?" "Yes, ma'am. My car is parked several blocks from here on the corner of Saratoga and Calvert. My driver is waiting for me. I am embarrassed to say that I am not entirely sure my hip will carry me those several blocks on its own this afternoon. I would consider it a personal kindness if you would walk those blocks with me as well." Elias did not hesitate. He did not look at the sky. He did not glance at the warming center sign that he could just barely see several more blocks the other way where the line would be starting to form. He looked at her face and he said, "Yes, ma'am, I will walk with you." They began to walk more slowly now, the joined hands swinging just slightly between them. Eleanor did not lean on him. She had her pride and she had her cane, and she had walked the streets of this city for many years on her own 2 feet. But she kept his hand. And Elias, who had not held the hand of another human being in many months, who had been touched in that whole long stretch of cold months only by the brief brush of a stranger's hand pressing a folded bill into his palm at a bus stop, walked beside her and felt the warmth of her glove against his fingers, and did not say anything because there is nothing to say that would have been as true as the walking itself. The wind off the harbor pushed at their backs. A pigeon lifted from the ledge of the marble courthouse and circled once and settled again. Somewhere down toward the harbor, a delivery truck blew its horn. The afternoon, which had felt for many straight days like a long, cold corridor with no door at the end of it, opened very slightly into a room. Eleanor did not ask him about his mother. She did not ask him where he lived, or who was waiting for him at home, or why a boy his age was standing alone on a downtown street corner on a school day in the middle of winter. She had learned over a long life of meeting people in difficult places that questions could fall on a person, the way hailstones fell on a tin roof, and that the most important things a person had to tell you would arrive in their own time and on their own feet, if you were patient enough to keep walking beside them. So she walked, and she let the silence stretch between them, in the way that good silences stretch, with give in them, the way good wool has give in it. They turned the corner onto Saratoga. The wind hit them sideways, and Eleanor tightened her grip on Elias's hand for half a second, and then loosened it again, almost apologetically. "Forgive me," she said. "It is all right, ma'am," he said. "I have been holding on to fences in this wind all day. A hand is better." She glanced at him sideways. She had not laughed properly in some time, not since the morning of her older sister's funeral. But a small dry sound came out of her. Now that was very close to laughter, and Elias looked up at her with the careful, pleased expression of a boy who has discovered against his own expectations that he is still capable of making a grown person smile. "Elias," she said, "do you live nearby?" "A sort of, ma'am." It was the same answer Elias Reed had once given to Theodore Harlan on a different street in a different city in a different year, though neither Elias nor Eleanor knew that, and it landed in the air between them with the same quiet weight. "Sort of," Eleanor said. She did not turn her head. She kept walking. She kept her gloved hand in his. "Expecting you for supper?" The question was put so gently, with so little pressure behind it, that Elias almost did not feel the edge of it until it had already passed under his skin. He looked at the sidewalk in front of him. He looked at the toes of his almost right-sized sneakers, scuffing one after the other across squares of concrete that had been laid down before his grandmother was born. He thought about the warming center on Saratoga, several blocks behind them now, where the line would be forming. He thought about the spiral notebook in his backpack, and the photograph of his mother in the blue dress and the peppermint candy he had not eaten yet. He thought briefly and against his will about his grandmother's apartment above the laundromat on Green Mount, and about the smell of cornbread she used to make on Sunday afternoons, a smell that had come up through the floor of the bedroom where he slept, and had woken him gently, the way a hand on a shoulder wakes you gently. "No, ma'am," he said, "not really." Eleanor nodded once. She did not stop walking. She did not change the rhythm of her cane. She did not turn her head or sharpen her voice or do any of the things that adults sometimes did when they were about to ask a child a question whose answer they could not really afford to hear. "I see," she said. That was all. "I see." And in the way she said it, in the quiet absence of any follow-up question, in the steady continuation of her small, slow steps beside him, Elias understood that she had heard him completely, and that she was not going to make him be any more than he had already said, and that whatever was going to come next would be her offer to make, and not his burden to carry. They walked another half-block. The wind picked up. A long, black car was parked at the curb ahead of them, the kind of car that did not announce itself, but was clearly not a taxi, with its engine running low, and a man in a dark coat and a wool driver's cap standing beside the rear door with his hands clasped behind his back. The man's eyes were on the street. When he saw Eleanor coming, his shoulders settled slightly, the way a man's shoulders settle when a worry he has been carrying for the past little while lifts off them. And he stepped forward and reached for the door handle. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Langston," he said as they came up. His eyes flickered once to Elias and then back to Eleanor's face. "I was beginning to wonder if I should come looking." "You were thinking about it, Leon. I could feel it from several blocks away." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "Leon, this is Mr. Elias Reed. He has been kind enough to walk me to the car. Mr. Reed, this is Leon Mercer. He has been driving me for many years." Leon did not extend a hand because he understood without being told that a handshake from a tall, grown man in a dark coat might be more than the small boy in front of him could comfortably absorb at that moment. He tipped his cap instead, the small, old-fashioned gesture he had not used with anyone in years. And he said with complete seriousness, "Mr. Reed, thank you for looking after Mrs. Langston." Elias did not know what to do with being called Mr. Reed. No one had ever called him Mr. Reed. Teachers had called him Elias. His mother had called him Elias and sometimes baby boy, and the older kids who had taken his lunch money on the playground and in 4th grade had called him things he tried very hard not to remember. Mr. Reed was a name that belonged to a grown man, a man with a job and a desk and a wife who packed his lunches, and it landed in his chest with a strange warm weight that he did not yet have words for. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. It was the only response he could think of that felt right. Eleanor released his hand. She did it slowly with the same formal care he had shown when he had begun to release her at the curb on Lexington and Calvert, and she did not let go entirely until she had a steady grip on the top of the open door with her free hand. She turned to face him on the sidewalk. The pale winter sun, which had broken through the clouds again, caught the white of her hair and made it look, for a moment, almost like a very small, soft crown. "Elias," she said, "I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to feel entirely free to say no." "Yes, ma'am. I have not had supper yet, and I do not particularly want to eat alone tonight." "There is a restaurant about some distance from here, a small one, in a neighborhood called Hampton, run by a woman who has been feeding me for many years. The food is plain and very good. I would be glad of the company if you would join me." She paused. She did not lean down. She did not soften her voice into the patronizing tone that adults sometimes used with children when they were trying to be kind. She spoke to Elias the way she would have spoken to any guest, with the small, dignified formality that had been the texture of her speech since she was a girl. "You are not obligated. Leon can take you wherever you need to go, with no supper at all if that is what you prefer. I only wanted to ask." Elias stood very still on the sidewalk in his uncle's coat and his almost right-sized sneakers, and he felt the wind move along the back of his neck, and he felt his stomach, which had been quiet for most of the afternoon, by sheer force of practice, turn over once at the word supper. He thought about the peppermint candy in his backpack. He thought about his grandmother's cornbread. He thought about his mother, who had told him once, sitting on the edge of his bed when he was a small boy and had not been able to sleep, that the only difference between a stranger and a friend was the moment when one of them decided to be kind. He looked at Eleanor's face. He looked at the patient gray eyes. He looked at Leon, who had stepped back a respectful half-pace and was pretending to inspect a small mark on the side of the car. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I would like that. Thank you, ma'am." Eleanor nodded once. The small, precise nod of a woman who had spent a lifetime closing small, important agreements, and gestured toward the open door of the car. Elias hesitated at the threshold, the way a person hesitates at the edge of a swimming pool, whose depth he cannot quite see. And then he climbed in. The seat was wider than the couch in his grandmother's apartment had been. The leather was warm. There was a soft hum somewhere beneath the floor that he realized after a moment was a heater running quietly to keep the inside of the car comfortable while it waited. He had never been inside a car like this. He sat very still, his backpack on his lap, both hands resting on top of it, and he tried very hard not to touch anything he did not need to touch. Eleanor settled in beside him with the slow, careful movements of a woman whose hip had finally been allowed to rest, and the small sigh that escaped her as she leaned back into the seat was the sigh of a person who had been holding something at arm's length for the last little while and was now permitted to set it down. Leon closed the door with a soft, well-engineered thunk that Elias could feel in his teeth, walked around to the front, and slid into the driver's seat. "Leon," Eleanor said, "call Clara, please, and tell her we will be 2 for supper, and that one of us is a young man with a very thoughtful face." "Yes, ma'am," Leon said. He glanced once into the rearview mirror, met Elias's eyes, and gave him a small, reassuring smile that did not require any words. The car pulled away from the curb. The streets of downtown Baltimore slid past the windows in a way Elias had never seen them slide from the back seat of a car like this. The broken sidewalks did not bite at his sneakers. The wind could not find the gaps in his coat. The strangers on the corners did not look through him. The neighborhood he had been walking for many days became very briefly a place he was simply passing through. He watched the buildings go by. He pressed one finger very lightly against the cold glass of the window and then took it away. They drove north through the long stretch of brick row houses on Charles Street, past the marble lions outside an old hotel, past the spires of an Episcopal church whose name Elias could not pronounce, but which his mother had once pointed out to him on a bus ride years ago. They drove past the green expanse of the Johns Hopkins campus, where students in long wool coats hurried along brick paths with stacks of books pressed against their chests. They turned west into a neighborhood of older houses and narrower streets, and the buildings began to lean toward each other in the close, familiar way of old Baltimore, with marble steps in front of each door, scrubbed white by generations of women with bristled brushes and pride. When they reached Hampton, it did not look like any neighborhood Elias knew. The streets were narrower than downtown, but they were brighter somehow, with strings of yellow bulbs hung between buildings on the main avenue and small shop fronts whose windows glowed warm against the gathering dusk. There was a hardware store, with a wooden sign that had been hand-painted by someone who clearly enjoyed painting signs. There was a record store whose front window held a row of old vinyl albums propped up against a faded velvet curtain. There was a bakery whose lights had just come on for the evening and whose chalkboard sidewalk sign read in someone's careful cursive, "Soup tonight, tomato, bread still warm." Leon pulled the car to the curb in front of a small storefront wedged between a flower shop and a tailor's. The sign above the door, painted in modest cream-colored letters on a deep green background, read simply, "Clara's." There was no menu posted in the window. There were no reviews. There was only a small wreath of dried lavender on the door and a single warm light burning behind the glass. Leon came around and opened the door for them. Eleanor stepped out first, slowly, with the cane finding the sidewalk before her foot did. Elias followed. The wind in Hampton was less than the wind downtown, blocked by the closeness of the buildings, and the air smelled even on the sidewalk of something warm and yeasted and almost sweet. The bell above the door of Clara's gave a soft brass chime as Leon held it open. The inside of the restaurant was small and warm and smelled like Clara's in another city on a different evening many years before, of bread that had been baking slowly for hours. There were perhaps 10 tables, each one covered with a plain white cloth, each one set with simple white plates and heavy silver that looked as if it had been polished by hand. The walls were painted a soft cream, and there were framed photographs hung in mismatched frames along one wall. Photographs of a young woman in a kitchen, of a man holding a small girl on his shoulders, of a wedding party standing in front of a stone church somewhere with mountains behind it. A woman in her later years came out from a swinging door at the back of the room, wiping her hands on a clean white towel. She was tall for her age and broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair pulled back into a loose bun and a face that had clearly spent a great deal of its life laughing. When she saw Eleanor standing inside the door, she made a small sound of pleasure that came from somewhere deep in her chest and crossed the room with her arms already opening. "Eleanor," she said, taking both of her hands. "It has been some time. Some time, Eleanor. I was about to send a man to your house to check that you were still breathing. Forgive me, Clara. The doctors have been keeping me on a short leash this winter. The doctors should mind their own business." Clara said it firmly, but she was smiling. She turned then and looked down at Elias, who was standing half a step behind Eleanor with his backpack clutched in front of him like a small shield. Clara's face did not change in any sudden way. She did not gasp or coo or do any of the things adults sometimes did when they noticed a child who looked the way Elias looked. She simply lowered herself slowly until her eyes were level with his. And she said with the same warm directness she had used with Eleanor, "And you must be the young man with the thoughtful face. I am Clara. This is my restaurant. You are very welcome here." "Thank you, ma'am," Elias said. "I'm Elias." "Elias," she repeated the name slowly, the way Eleanor had done on the crosswalk, as if the name deserved its proper weight. "A beautiful name. Are you hungry, Elias?" He hesitated. He had been taught in the past many days not to admit to hunger in front of people who did not know him, because hunger admitted out loud was a thing that made adults uncomfortable, and uncomfortable adults made decisions that did not always end well for small boys. But Clara's face was patient, and Eleanor was standing quietly behind him, and the smell of the bread was so strong and so good that he could feel it in his throat. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I think I am." "Understood. Then we have already done the most important part." She led them to a table near the front window, where the last of the late afternoon light came in soft and pale through the glass, and she pulled out a chair for Elias with the same formal courtesy she would have shown a senator. He sat. The chair was solid and warm and creaked very faintly under him, the way good old chairs do. Clara disappeared back through the swinging door, and a moment later, a young woman in a long apron brought a basket of bread to the table, still warm from the oven, with a small dish of softened butter and another of dark green olive oil. Eleanor settled herself across from Elias with a quiet sigh. She set her cane carefully against the side of the table, where it would not fall. She removed her gloves and folded them neatly. She removed the silk scarf from around her neck and laid it across her lap. Then she reached for the breadbasket and tore a piece for herself, slowly, and pushed the basket gently toward the middle of the table where Elias could reach it. "Eat as much as you like, Elias," she said. "Clara will keep bringing it as long as we keep eating it. That is how she is." Elias reached for a piece of bread. His hand was shaking just slightly, in the way hands shake when a body has been waiting too long for something and finally allows itself to believe that the thing is real. He tore the bread carefully, the way he would have torn a page he did not want to damage. He dipped a small corner of it in the olive oil. He put it in his mouth. The bread tasted like a memory he did not know he had. He chewed slowly. He did not cry. He had decided somewhere on the drive over that he was not going to cry in front of Eleanor, but his eyes stung, and he kept them down on the white tablecloth, and he ate. Eleanor did not watch him eat. That was the kindness Elias noticed first, and the one he would remember for the rest of his life. Eleanor did not lean forward in her chair, did not study the boy's face, did not say any of the soft, pitying things adults sometimes said when they saw a hungry child eating in front of them. She simply tore her own piece of bread, dipped it in her own oil, and turned her face slightly toward the window so that he could eat in peace. She spoke now and then about small, easy things, the way Hampton had changed in the last many years, a book she had been reading whose author had a strange habit of describing weather, a grandniece who had recently learned to play the cello and had performed a recital in a church basement for an audience of 9 people, 6 of whom were related to her. She spoke the way a person speaks to fill a room with a gentle, undemanding sound, the way you leave a radio on for someone who is recovering from something difficult. Clara brought soup, a thick lentil soup with bits of carrot and a swirl of olive oil on top in a heavy white bowl that held its heat. She brought a plate of roasted chicken with potatoes and a small mound of greens cooked soft with garlic. She brought a tall glass of milk for Elias and a cup of black tea with lemon for Eleanor, and she refilled the bread basket twice without being asked. She did not ask Elias any questions. She did not ask Eleanor any questions either. She simply moved through the small, warm room like a woman who had decided long ago that the people at her tables were her people, and that her job was to feed them and let them be. Halfway through the chicken, Elias set his fork down. He had eaten more in the last little while than he had eaten in the last several days combined, and his stomach, which had grown used to being empty, was protesting the sudden bounty in small, uncertain ways. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the plate. He looked at Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said, "may I ask you something?" "You may ask me anything." Elias took a small breath. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor did not answer right away. She set her own fork down. She picked up her teacup, took a slow sip and set it back into its saucer, with the careful precision of a woman who had spent a long life around fragile things. She looked at Elias across the white tablecloth, and the last of the afternoon light through the window caught the silver of her hair and made it look for a moment almost soft gold. "That is a good question," she said. "It deserves an honest answer." She paused. She folded her napkin once very slowly with both hands, the way a woman folds something she intends to hand over. "When I was about your age, Elias," she said, "I lived with my mother in a small house on the south side of Baltimore that no longer stands. The neighborhood is gone now, paved over for an interstate. But in those years, it was where the steel workers lived, the people who worked at the mill down on the harbor. My father was one of them. He had been killed in an accident at the mill when I was a small child, and my mother had taken in laundry to keep the 2 of us fed. There were winters, more than one of them, when my mother and I ate the same supper every night for several weeks running, because rice and a single onion was what we could afford. My mother was a proud woman. She never told anyone how thin our table had become. One Friday afternoon in winter, very much like this one, I was walking home from school, and I slipped on a patch of ice on the corner of Hanover Street, and I fell so hard that I split open the skin on my chin and could not seem to get back up. She touched her own chin once lightly with the tip of one finger. A small, thin scar ran along the underside of it, almost invisible. A woman was walking on the other side of the street, a stranger. She crossed over to me. She knelt down on the ice. She pressed her own clean handkerchief against my chin, and she walked me the several blocks to my house. And when my mother opened the door and saw me there, the woman did not say anything except that she lived just around the corner, and that she had been raised where she came from to walk a child home if a child was bleeding. Eleanor looked at Elias steadily across the table. Her name was Mrs. Novak. My mother and she became friends for the next many years until I left for college. Mrs. Novak brought a covered dish to our house every Sunday afternoon. She would not let my mother refuse it. She always said she had cooked too much, and there was no one at her own table to eat it, and she would be insulted if it went to waste. We knew she was lying every Sunday. For many years my mother never said so, and Mrs. Novak never said so. And that lie was the thing that kept the two of us alive. She let the silence sit for a moment. "You did for me today, Elias," Eleanor said, "what Mrs. Novak did for me a long time ago. So I am doing for you what she did for me." Elias was very still. He looked down at the white tablecloth for a long time. The story had landed in him in a place that did not yet have words for what it was feeling. He thought about a young Eleanor Langston who had once been a small girl named Eleanor on a sidewalk in Baltimore, bleeding from her chin and unable to stand up. He thought about a woman named Mrs. Novak, whoever she had been, who had crossed a street on a cold afternoon and pressed her clean handkerchief against a child's face and had carried that small kindness forward into many years of Sunday suppers. He thought about his own mother, who had said to him once on a hot August evening, sitting on the front stoop of the apartment on Green Mount, that the world was held up not by strong people, but by gentle ones, and that the gentle ones were almost always small, and were almost always tired, and were almost always doing it anyway. He had not understood her then. He thought he might be beginning to understand her now. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was very small, "I do not know how to say thank you for this." "You do not have to," Eleanor said. "You already did at the curb." They finished their meal slowly. Clara brought a small dish of bread pudding for Elias without being asked, with a thin pour of warm cream over the top, and Eleanor did not protest. The light through the window deepened from pale gold into the soft slate blue that comes just before evening, and the other tables in the restaurant began to fill with quiet people in coats, neighbors and regulars who nodded to Clara and to Eleanor as they passed, and who did not stare at the small boy in the too large coat, sitting at the table by the window. Elias ate the bread pudding one careful spoonful at a time, making it last the way he had learned to make small good things last. He did not finish it. He set the spoon down with one bite still in the bowl, because he had read somewhere a long time ago that this was what polite people did at the homes of strangers. And he had been holding on to that small piece of information for years, against a moment he had never expected to come. When the meal was over, Eleanor settled the bill with Clara, in a way that Elias did not see, because Eleanor had a particular skill for handling money in a manner that did not turn the evening into a transaction. Clara walked them to the door. She bent down to Elias's height again, and she said, "You come back any time, Elias, with Eleanor or without. You tell whoever is at the door that Clara is expecting you, and there will always be a plate." "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. "Thank you, ma'am." Outside, the air had grown colder, but it did not bite the way it had earlier in the afternoon. Leon was waiting beside the car with the same calm patience he had shown on Calvert Street, and he opened the rear door without a word. Eleanor paused on the sidewalk before getting in. She turned to Elias. "I'm going to ask you one more thing tonight, Elias, and again, you are free to say no." She looked at him carefully. "Leon and I are going to drive home now. I live in a house on a quiet street in a neighborhood called Roland Park, not far from here. It is a house with more rooms than any one old woman needs. There is a small guest room on the first floor with a bed that has clean sheets on it, and a bathroom of its own, and a door that locks from the inside. There is a woman named Evelyn who has worked for me for many years and who lives in a small apartment over the carriage house behind the main house. She is the kindest person I have ever met, which is saying a great deal. I would like to offer you that room for tonight and for as many nights as you need while we figure out together what comes next. You would not be a guest who has to earn his keep. You would be a young man under my roof, and you would be safe there." She paused. She did not lean down. She did not soften her voice. "You may say no, Elias. Leon will take you anywhere you ask him to take you. I will not be hurt and I will not be offended. But I am a woman in my later years, and I have learned that some offers when they come should be made plainly, so I am making it plainly." Elias stood on the sidewalk outside Clara's restaurant in his uncle's coat and his almost right-size sneakers, and he looked up at the small white-haired woman in the long camel-colored coat. And he thought about a bed with clean sheets that he had not slept in for many nights, and a door that locks from the inside, and a hand in a gray glove that had closed around his at the edge of a crosswalk and had not let go for too long, and had not let go too soon. He thought about the warming center on Saratoga, several miles away now, where the line would already be at the door. He thought about his grandmother, wherever she was. He thought about the photograph of his mother in the blue dress in the inside pocket of the coat closest to his heart. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you, ma'am, I would like that." The drive to Roland Park took longer than the drive to Hampton, because Roland Park was farther north, in a part of the city Elias had only ever seen from the side of city buses. He watched out the window as the streets grew quieter, and the houses grew larger, and the trees, even leafless in winter, grew tall enough to arch over the road and meet in the middle. Eleanor did not speak. Leon did not speak. There was only the soft hum of the heater and the quiet swish of the tires on pavement and the occasional small click of the turn signal at an intersection. Eleanor's house, when they reached it, was not the kind of house Elias had imagined a wealthy woman would live in. It was a long, low brick house set back from the road behind a low stone wall, with ivy growing up one side and a wide wooden porch across the front. There was a wreath of dried hydrangea on the front door, and a single soft light burning in the entry hall window. Evelyn was already waiting in the front hall when they came inside, and she was exactly as Eleanor had described her. A tall, slim woman in her later years with close-cropped silver hair and a face that had been kind for so long that the kindness had settled into the lines around her eyes permanently. She did not make a fuss over Elias. She simply said, "Welcome, young man. The guest room is made up, and there is a hot bath, drawn for you whenever you would like one. Are you tired?" Elias, who had not realized until that moment how tired he was, nodded. That was the beginning. The story did not end that night, because real stories rarely do. It went on through the rest of the winter and into the spring. Eleanor's lawyers quietly and carefully helped to locate Elias's grandmother in a long-term care facility in Arundel County, where the cousin had finally arranged for her after her heart had failed, and they helped to make sure she received the medical care she needed for the remainder of her years. They helped Elias become her legal ward with Eleanor and Evelyn named as guardians in the event that she could not return. Elias went back to school, a different school, where he was allowed to be quiet and was not asked questions he could not answer. He kept the photograph of his mother in the inside pocket of a new coat that fit him properly, and he kept the peppermint candy for another several months until he no longer needed to save it. And then one Sunday afternoon, he sat on the back porch of Eleanor's house in Roland Park and ate it slowly, watching the dogwoods bloom. The story of how they met did not become a viral video. There were no security cameras on the corner of Lexington and Calvert that afternoon, and no one in the city of Baltimore had any idea that one of the wealthiest women on the eastern seaboard had walked across a downtown crosswalk holding the hand of a hungry child. The story stayed where it began, between the two of them, the way the most important stories often do. Eleanor did not write about it. Elias did not tell anyone at his new school. Only Leon and Clara and Evelyn knew, and they were the kind of people who knew how to keep a thing that was not theirs to tell. Years passed. Eleanor lived longer than her doctors had told her she would, the way stubborn women sometimes do when they have found a reason to stay. She saw Elias graduate from high school. She saw him accepted into a university on a scholarship that Eleanor had arranged without ever letting him know she had arranged it. She did not see him graduate from college because she died quietly in her sleep, in the long brick house in Roland Park one autumn morning, with Evelyn holding one of her hands and Elias sitting in the chair beside the bed, holding the other. In Eleanor's will, there was a letter for Elias. It was short. It read, "I want you to remember 3 things. The first is that your mother chose your name. The second is that you took my hand when no one else would. The third is that the world is held up by gentle people, and you, Elias Reed, were the strongest gentleness of my long life. Elias is a grown man now. He runs an organization in Baltimore that finds elderly people who have outlived the people who used to walk with them, people whose children have moved away and whose friends have died, and pairs them with neighbors and volunteers who walk with them to the grocery store, to the pharmacy, to the corner where the bus stops, to wherever it is that they need to go but cannot quite manage to go alone anymore. He named the organization after a woman in South Baltimore he never met. He calls it Novak House. There is a small plaque on the wall just inside the front door of its office on Calvert Street, several blocks from the corner of Lexington, where the whole story began. The plaque is plain brass. It reads in simple block letters. Take my hand, I will walk you across. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment telling me what part stayed with you, and subscribe for more stories of quiet kindness and second chances. Thank you for being here.